Yeah, it looks great.
Excellent. So this is a paper that was just published in the very end of January in Nature Climate Change. And Scott Getz suggested that I could come to this group today and present it to you all. So I focused the presentation very much on sort of summarizing the content of the paper and some closely related work, but hopefully at the end we can open up the discussion more widely because there seems to be a variety of interests here and some of my co-authors on this work who can speak for themselves about the content of the paper. So we titled the paper Complexity Revealed in the Greening of the Arctic, and that's because in this study, which is several years in the making, I would say now, we're trying to bring together two different disciplines, sort of plant ecology and remote sensing, and merge our understanding of what's going on in the Arctic and this Arctic greening signal that we're seeing from satellites, and we're seeing vegetation change on the ground, and sort of asking how do those two signals meet and what does it all mean? And within the paper, we try and provide a bit of a future-looking perspective on how we can better tackle some of these complexities and how climate change is reshaping these ecosystems and how we go about sensing that and figuring out the drivers of the change. So today in this presentation, I'll sort of lead the effort, but Jeff Kirby, who was a co-lead author on the paper, is with us. Logan Burnham might be with us, and Scott Getz is here as well. So if you have any questions, and then Uma, who's also joined, for any of us, please feel free to direct those questions to individuals. And I put the link to the paper here, and you can probably make that connection through yourself. So to sort of start off the presentation, I want to start really big at the sort of global scale and think about the concept of scale. So there's this lovely quote, "The problem of relating phenomena across scales is the central problem in biology." And that's also the central problem in Arctic biology and in remote sensing, et cetera. And so that sort of concept was perhaps what united us when we started working on this paper. And I'll flip over here to a photograph. This is from my Arctic field research site. It's Qikiqtarjuaq Herschel Island on the Yukon Arctic coast. It's pretty close to the border with Alaska there, so quite close to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And this is a photograph from last summer taken by Jeff Kirby, the co-lead author of this paper, who happens to be a photographer as well. And in this photograph, you can see a heterogeneous tundra landscape. You can actually see a herd of muskox in the middle there. You can see a retrogressive thaw slump in the distance. And in the far distance, you can see our camp at the historic settlement on the island. And it's this complex tundra landscape that's undergoing rapid change here and all around the Arctic. And yet, we're sensing that change from space with large scale pixels that don't always capture all this heterogeneity. So matching what we see on the ground with what we see from space is quite a challenge. And the sort of simple story here is that the Arctic is warming and this is leading to vegetation change, and we're sensing that vegetation change from satellite data. And what hopefully this talk and our discussion will bring up is that perhaps the story isn't quite as simple, and perhaps there's more complexities at play here. And why this all matters is because the tundra protects huge stores of frozen carbon. And so here you can see one of the retrogressive thaw slumps on Qikiqtarjuaq, my field site. And you can see that thin layer of the plants above with the ice-rich permafrost below. And as plants are disturbed or as plants increase in growth, that changes that sort of protective layer that's above those frozen carbon stocks. And so if we lose that frozen carbon back to the atmosphere, there's about maybe, depending on how you count it, about a third of the world's soil carbon at these high latitudes. And if we lost a fair portion of that, that could almost double atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And there's other feedbacks at play. So whether it's through albedo, the reflectance of the tundra and permafrost thaw, or whether it's through the carbon cycle, we can potentially be accelerating climate change in these systems. And so in order to figure out those climate feedbacks, we need to know how vegetation is changing. And we need to be able to sense that across the tundra biome as a whole. And then it's not just the sort of climate feedbacks that potentially are important. There's also feedbacks to wildlife. And we often think about polar bears as a sort of charismatic megafauna of climate change. But there's other fluffy white creatures out there that are responding to the warming climate as well. And I'll bring up this fuzzy mesofauna, or mesoflora, I should say here. This is Areophorus vaginatum. It's one of the species that is responding positively as things warm in the Arctic, and it's a part of that greening signal. And so I'll go back to the greening here. So I'm presenting now 3 different circumpolar views of the planet. And in these pixels, you see greener pixels and browner pixels and gray pixels. So the green pixels represent places where in each of these 3 satellite data sets, we're seeing a greening trend over time. The brown pixels represent where we're seeing a decreasing trend in greenness. So this, in these 3 maps, the greenness index is the NDVI index, normalized difference vegetation index. And what you can see as you look across these 3 maps is a lot of green pixels out there, some brown, some gray being sort of no trend. And as you compare across the GIMS data set, the MODIS data set, and the Landsat data set, this 3rd map here is from a paper that's currently in revision that Logan Berner is leading with Scott Getz and others. So new research that Logan said I could share with you today. What you can see are sort of different greening patterns across the Arctic. And so that was one of the things that we as a group of co-authors had noticed over time and sort of was the beginning of that complexity that we wanted to talk about. And you can zoom into particular regions. So here we'll go into the sort of Western Arctic region of Alaska and the Yukon. And you can start to see that heterogeneity as you zoom in there more strongly. So in the GIMS data set, it shows really prominent greening that's not as obvious in the MODIS data, for example. And it's not just a greening signal, there were browning pixels in there. And so this concept that the tundra is greening, but it also is browning. This is a photograph again of one of the retrogressive thaw slumps on Qikqtarjuaq. This is taken by a PhD student of mine. And you can see really dramatic disturbances in the landscape like this, but a decreasing greenness signal could be due to other factors as well. It could be loss of photosynthetically active biomass in the plants due to, say, a freezing event in the spring, or due to a lot of herbivory at a site, or there's a variety of different factors that could theoretically, ecologically on the ground, be creating a browning signal. And so one of the first things our authorship felt was really needed in this area was some more clear definitions of what we were talking about when we talked about greening and what we were talking about when we were talking about browning. So here are 2 proposed definitions, and this was also something that was very much discussed at the National Academy's workshop that Scott Getz led over a year ago now in DC. And so we met there as well, and that report as well provided these sort of different definitions to make sure we're all on the same page, because an ecologist saying the word greening could be meaning something quite different from a remote sensing scientist saying the word greening. And so in the Nature Climate Change paper, we summarized our understanding of those terms and how we're referring to them with this figure here. So in the figure, you can see sort of 3 panels, the greening panels at the top, you've got a browning panel in the middle, and a sort of no trend panel at the bottom. And what we were trying to illustrate here is that there can be a lot of landscape heterogeneity that can lead to either greening or browning being an increase in productivity or decrease in productivity, or no trend in productivity. And it matters what's happening within the pixels as well as the amount of greening or browning. So you've got a potentially sort of more linear greening trend. You could have a sort of greening event where you get a step change and then you have a change to a more green tundra landscape. You can have the opposite again with the browning. You could have sort of no trend, or you could just have a lot of heterogeneity such that there's no clear trend because there's greening and browning going on across your time series. And all of these patterns and other patterns are probably out there in the real world pixels that we're sensing with satellite data. But it can be complex to sort of simplify that message down to, are we seeing a greening trend or not? So sometimes doing these sort of linear trends might be hiding some of that complexity. And if you look across the Pan-Arctic with different data sets, and here I'm just presenting Logan's work for the Landsat data, but we've also done similar analyses with the other data sets, we find that most of the Arctic is greening. So it's about 20% of the pixels show greening and only 4% or so show browning. So it's still a dominant signal of greening. There's browning out there as well. And you can see in Logan's map here how it's areas like Central Alaska where there are forest fires, and Siberia where you're seeing more of that browning pattern. So to sort of conclude this first bit of the presentation, I would summarize it by saying Arctic ecosystems are greening, but the satellite data sets do not entirely agree, and there's variability around this signal. So the next section of the talk, I'll talk a little bit about what might be causing the greening that we're seeing from satellites, and that brings us to more the ecology on the ground. So this is a photograph of myself and PhD student Gergana in the field last summer, monitoring a long-term monitoring plot. And so I'll start by just showing some nice photographic representations of the changes that might be leading to a greening. And I'll start with this beautiful dryas flower to represent vegetation change. And that's increasing plant cover and plants growing where they didn't used to grow before, but it could also be plants leafing out earlier in the spring. So a sort of longer growing season as well. But there could be other things going on that would alter that greening signal that we are perceiving from space. And one of that could be sort of wetland change or change in standing water within tundra landscapes. It could also be related to snowmelt dynamics, so particularly the loss of snow patches that would have resided on the landscape well into the summer. It could be sort of greening and browning trends could be due to changing herbivory patterns of, say, migratory species like these. I think these are reindeer from Siberia. And where there are fires, it could be due to fire. So a fire goes through, you'll get a sort of browning event from that. And then as the landscape recovers, you can actually get a very strong greening trend as well. And finally, sort of permafrost thaw dynamics could be at play, both leading to sort of dramatic disturbances like retrogressive thaw slumps, but also increasing active layer depths could be releasing more nutrients and stimulating plant productivity. So those are some of the factors, and now I'm going to sort of focus in on some of the vegetation side of things, and I'll start with talking about the concept of shrubification, if you've heard of that word, so increases in shrubs as a particular functional group within tundra ecosystems. And so many years ago now, during my PhD, I put together a literature review of the studies indicating increasing shrubs across the Arctic, and that paper was in Environmental Research Letters, came out in 2011. And since then, I've been trying to keep the database up to date. And actually last night, surprisingly, our latest paper got published. They didn't forewarn us, but you can check that out. It's in Global Ecology and Biogeography. And we've combined the latest version of that shrub review dataset with a very similar dataset from savanna ecosystems. So trying to compare the shrub change going on in the tundra to the savanna and what the climate and other drivers of that change might be. But what we're seeing in the Arctic is most studies indicating increasing shrub cover. There might be a little bit of publication bias within that signal, but it does seem to be a dominant signal seen across many, many sites. And I'll just visually show you what some of that shrub change might look like, again, going back to the Qeqertark field site at which I work. So these are a series of photographs. So on the left, you have 1987, and then on the right are all the years that I've been out at the site. And you can sort of watch visually as I flip through the slides how that landscape is changing. So even between the first 2 years, you can see quite dramatic increase in the shrubs. And every year as we go back to that site, the shrubs continue to increase. They're growing taller in canopy height and becoming more dense across the landscape. And this last photo was just from last summer. So that's the kind of change that we're often talking about when we talk about shrub increases in these ecosystems. And because shrubs have a greener sort of reflectance and they have more biomass, that could lead to satellites deriving a sort of greening signal from these landscapes. And so at our field site, we're also teaming up to monitor changes in these systems. And so it's a Yukon Territorial Park, and there's a long-term ecological monitoring program being run by the park. And that monitoring program has been going since 1999, and there are long-term plots, and there are phenology transects, and the park rangers and us as visiting scientists help to conduct the measurements each year. And so next series of slides I'll show you are from the long-term monitoring plots and the changes we've seen in those plots. So when I first started working at the site, this is what I saw. So you've got plant cover on the left here and bare ground on the right. So these were the data, and then I started collecting the data myself and with my research group. And over time, what we've seen is a pretty dramatic increase in the plant cover at this site and a real strong loss of bare ground cover. And we've also seen an increase in the canopy heights and of specific functional groups within these plots. So this may be sort of typical of many sites around the Arctic. And when we, through the International Tundra Experiment Network, conducted sort of cross-site work with these kind of monitoring plots all around the Arctic, we found the same kind of signals. So increases in the shrubs, which are indicated here with the green bars, and decreases in bare ground cover across sites around the Arctic. So in general, on the ground, we're seeing increasing plant cover over time. And when we're thinking about the drivers of that change, it does seem to be that climate warming is an important factor. We find very climate sensitive growth of the shrubs, but there might be, again, more complexity at play here. So it could be that climate warming leading to permafrost thaw, that active layer depth increase and the stimulation of nutrients stimulating plant growth might be a more important driver than, say, the direct influence of warming temperatures on the plants. And we're also finding that soil moisture and the sort of context, the landscape context of the plants is really important too. So we see more change in wetter parts of tundra landscapes than we see in drier parts. And it's quite hard to sort of piece all of this together, especially when you have warming going on that's also leading to permafrost thaw, and that's changing the hydrology of these landscapes. So all these drivers are at play interacting to influence the vegetation change that we see. So to summarize that section of the talk, we're finding that warming's linked to greening, and that we're seeing different vegetation responding across the landscape, but that the landscape and microclimate is sort of influencing that response. And so one of the other things we talk about in the paper is when our different greening signals don't always totally match up. So I'll sort of go into some examples here of what we mean. So this is another figure from the manuscript, and what you can see here, we're comparing two different sites, the Ecology site where I work, which I've been showing you photographs of and talking about, and then a contrasting site, which is Kangerlussuaq in Greenland. And Jeff Kirby, the lead co-author, has worked there. And so, and Eric Post contributed some data so that we could look at similar changes that we're seeing at both of these sites and compare how that relates to the greening signal. So in this plot on the left side, you have drone imagery of the two sites. And you can see that the Ecology site has a much more homogeneous green landscape, and the Kangerlussuaq site is very heterogeneous. And then as you move into the middle panels, this is the greening trend in the MODIS data at these sites. So Ecology has a pretty strong increase, and at Kangerlussuaq, you have a lot more variability year to year in NDVI. And then the final set of plots are the increases in shrub abundance that are being observed in the long-term monitoring plots on the ground. And at both sites, we're seeing relatively dramatic increases in shrub cover. So this is just to sort of illustrate that at two sites, we see increases in shrub cover in our plots. But at one site, we see a strong greening trend. At the other site, we just see interannual variability and heterogeneity. And where we see more heterogeneity in the greening trend over time is also where we're seeing more heterogeneity in the landscape. So perhaps those plots aren't representing the landscape scale signal of greening. And now I'm going to flip over to a different sort of an example. So this is thinking about the phenology as a greening response. So the timing of leaf emergence in the deciduous plants and senescence at the end of the year. And so we're going back to the Ecology site here. And what you can see in the plot are seasonal curves fit to the MODIS data across years at this site. And I've taken a phenocam measurement or photographs, so from time-lapse cameras, and sort of indicated where those dates are within the seasonal signal. And so you can see what this landscape looks like at different times of year. So we've got June, it's pretty brown, the leaves have not yet emerged from the buds, and that's sort of 18th of June, and then you come back a few days later, 26th of June, and the leaves have all flushed out, and you suddenly have a very green landscape. And then it stays green for just over a month, and then things start to go brown pretty quick, and by the time you're in mid-August, you have a very senesced brown landscape. Or that's what it looks like as an ecologist on the ground. But if you look at the NDVI data from, say, the MODIS satellites, you can see a seasonal signal that suggests a much more green landscape later into the season. So it tracks the greening of the plants relatively well at the beginning of the season, and then maybe isn't quite capturing the senescence that we're seeing on August 15th there. But in those MODIS data, you can see the growing season seems to be getting longer over time as derived from the MODIS data, and the sort of peak NDVI seems to be getting a bit higher. So the darker lines there are earlier in the time series in the early 2000s, and the later years are in yellow going through green in that color scale. And so if we compare now what we're seeing on the ground in our phenology transects and plots to what the MODIS data are seeing, we start to see sort of different signals. So with just the phenology data on the ground, so comparing when the buds burst for the deciduous species and when those leaves turn yellow, we are seeing an earlier growing season in spring, or an earlier leaf emergence date. But we're also seeing a little bit earlier of a senescence date as well. So overall, we're not seeing a change in the growing season length. It's just shifting a little bit within the year. Whereas when we flip over to the MODIS data, it's showing an earlier beginning of the season and a later end of the season. So a real increase in the growing season length. So somehow the satellites aren't really sensing necessarily what's going on with those deciduous plants on the landscape. Now keep in mind, these deciduous species are not the only land cover there. They're still probably the dominant plant within those landscapes, but we also have a lot of moss on the ground. We have other more evergreen species, and a lot of landscape level complexity and heterogeneity in that signal. So that's a part of the reason for the complexity here. So to sort of wrap up that section of the talk, we're finding that tundra vegetation is increasing, but not always where satellites indicate greening or vice versa. And that landscape level heterogeneity seems to be an important part of explaining when things don't match up. And so then I wanted to sort of go in the final section of the talk here and talk about collecting data across scales and maybe help us think about what we can do with the data we have collected across scales to really get at the key questions that we want to answer about how climate change is influencing these Arctic systems. And so in the paper, we talk about scale, both sort of spatial and temporal scales, but also across a variety of sort of different axes. So in the paper, we have this figure where we show that when you're thinking about Arctic greening and browning trends, you got to think about the spectral resolution of the data you're working with. You got to think about the extent of the data you're working with, the spatial resolution, the temporal resolution across the growing season, between years, et cetera. The levels of organization, so are you dealing with data from plots or individual plants or landscapes, or are you really asking questions at the biome scale? And then you also might want to think about trophic hierarchies, and are you talking about just the plants, or are you talking about other trophic levels too? So all of these different scales and hierarchies are interacting with each other and potentially important to the signal you're trying to detect. And so I'll just briefly pick one of them here. So this subplot of one of our figures illustrates the fact that with the different satellite data sets, we have different deployment years on the y-axis there, and the different satellite platforms cover different ranges of wavelengths. So even when we're calculating the exact same indices off of different satellite data sets that also come at different spatial resolutions and different temporal durations, et cetera, we're not necessarily comparing exactly apples to apples. So there's variation here in the data that we're working with. And those greening and browning patterns that we're talking about vary across spatial scales. So this is a really nice illustration from the National Academy's report, where you can see in the AVHRR data, you have these really big pixels showing greening, and you can see greening sometimes when you look at the higher resolution Landsat data, but other times what you pick up in the coarser resolution data don't really seem to be there in the more high resolution data. And so why is that the case? And so one of the ways to get at questions like that is by collecting higher resolution remote sensing data in situ. So by adding in drone or airborne data and getting that landscape level complexity that we're maybe missing on either end, either with the ecological data collection or the coarse grain satellite remote sensing. And so that's where the above project comes in, and this has been a great resource even for myself working in Canada. We had an AVIRIS sensor flight twice actually over our site last summer, which was really exciting, once in the beginning of July and once at the end of July. And we're hoping to be working with those data over the spring and really integrate that into the work that we've been doing. And so this is just, so not from that site because we haven't had a chance to do that yet, but from the year previous, Jeff and I went up to Ellesmere Island to Alexandra Fjord, which is the site of Greg Henry. And he's been working there since the early 90s and has long-term plots. And so we brought drones up, and this is sort of an illustration of the kinds of data that we could collect to really cross scales. So blown up here, you can see one of the ITEX warming chambers. You can see the footprint of where the chamber was. We removed the chamber. And then we're working with our RGB and multispectral sensors here. And so you can see the green to red is NDVI on top of that plot at very high resolution. And then you can see the multispectral data in that part of the landscape sitting on a large orthomosaic of the RGB data for the entire site. So you can see how we can be collecting data across scales to answer some of these questions that we might have about how, in this case, experimental warming might relate to the landscape level variability in microclimates, and whether we're seeing the same kind of responses of enhanced productivity and higher NDVI in these warming experiments as we're seeing across the landscape. So to sort of wrap up that section of the talk, I sort of summarize by saying landscape level data collection across scales can help us understand the drivers and patterns and trends of tundra greening and browning. And so I'll just wrap up the end of the talk here with talking a little bit about some of the current, ongoing, and future initiatives that we've been involved with, and maybe to stimulate discussion with the group here. So it's from some of the data collection I just showed you up on Ellesmere Island. And what we, Jeff and myself and others, have been trying to do is bring together all the people who are collecting drone data at high latitude sites around the Arctic. So these are some images from some of our different sites, and we formed this network called the High Latitude Drone Ecology Network. And so it's currently about 40 scientists, probably more than that by now, collecting data at 42 different Arctic locations. And if anyone in the group is collecting drone data that hasn't already contributed, wants to get involved, please let us know. And so this is some of the work that we're working on right now, is taking the greening trends from the different satellite data products for these different sites, looking at which sites show stronger versus weaker greening trends, more or less heterogeneity, and then comparing that to the landscape level heterogeneity we can pick up on the ground in the drone data. And so here are just some illustrations of some of the sites, particularly within the above domain. So we have ARCUS in Alaska, Toolik Lake in Alaska, and the site that I work at, Kikiktarik. And you can see here the drone data nested within the Landsat data at those sites. NDVI, again, with greener being higher NDVI. And we can also use the above airborne data and neon airborne data to give us that additional scale level. So here's drone data. It's kind of subtle in the map on the left there, nested within the airborne data, but I did a sort of zoom in so you can see that the drone data are very high resolution, even relative to data collected from a plane. And so we're working on those analyses at the moment, and if you want to hear more about them, please do get in touch or ask us questions in the discussion afterwards. And so to wrap up the paper, what we were hoping to do in that paper is provide a bit of a new perspective, bringing remote sensing and ecology together to talk about what the greening signals that we're seeing are and what research we need to do next to better understand the drivers of that change. And so to summarize our perspective, I think it comes down to three things. So sort of emphasizing that we really need to bridge the scale gaps between in situ and satellite observations. And drone and airborne data is one way to get at that, to really understand whether the signals on the ground are the same that we're perceiving from space, and when they aren't, to understand why they aren't matching up. And we also need to incorporate that landscape level heterogeneity and also the uncertainty we have in our different methods of estimating greening at landscape scale. So sort of both incorporating that heterogeneity and uncertainty in the ecological data and in the remote sensing data, and integrating and analyzing them together in an integrated fashion. And finally, we need to sort of integrate new ways of sensing change in plant communities. And so that's where perhaps hyperspectral data come in, and structural data and other forms of data that we can use to understand the change that we're seeing in new ways and compare across different types of data. So I'll go back to how I started the presentation with this idea of Arctic greening as a sort of simple story. It's climate warming leading to vegetation change, leading to the greening we see from space. And I'll sort of illustrate here that there's a lot more complexity to that signal, both in the drivers and even in how we sense that greening signal on the ground. And so that was the motivation for the paper. And hopefully some of what I've been presenting to you today sort of stimulates ideas and discussion points that we could talk about. And yeah, so it's definitely a climate warming signal, but the question is, are we talking about direct drivers of warming influencing plant composition, or through indirect drivers through something like permafrost thaw altering nutrients that's creating the signals that we're seeing? And knowing what the drivers are really important if we want to make effective projections of how the Arctic is going to change over the next 100 years and influence the global climate feedbacks and protect or not the carbon that's frozen in permafrost soils. So I'll end on this beautiful photograph again by Jeff and the sort of statement that we think that the Arctic is greening, but there's uncertainty and complexity in that signal. And there's a lot of work to do to figure that out. And this is a sort of thank you slide to our funders and the above team, and to my research group, Team Shrub, for all the data that they've collected. And I'll sort of end here. I'll leave this slide up of discussion questions and then turn it over to the group. So feel free to ask me anything, and our co-authors who are listening in here. And maybe we can talk a bit about how we bridge scale gaps, or even just figure out the optimum scales of observation for some of the ecological parameters or other parameters of interest. And how do we, so all of what I've been talking to you about today is about the above ground plant signal. How do we capture the vegetation change that's happening below ground? And is it possible in these Arctic systems that actually a lot of the true productivity increase signal could be happening below the surface in the roots where the active layer is getting deeper? And we can chat about what the new technologies are that can help us understand and sense greening and browning and the drivers of that change. So I'll end there. Thanks very much. And I'll turn it over for any questions.
Thank you, Isla. Feel free to chime in, anybody that has questions.
I can also put the chat box up so I can see those. I can figure out how to do that.
Hey, Isla, it's Crystal Schaff.
Hello, Crystal.
From UMass Boston. Hey, Isla. All the NDVI you're showing is the usual NDVI product, right? You're not making any of that yourself.
We make it ourselves off of the drone data. The MODIS and the AVHR, the GIMS 3G product, yeah.
And the MODIS is version 6.
Version 6.
Okay, mod whatever it is, 13 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I just wondered if you'd found any. You're up so high, you might want to try looking at the view angle corrected versions of VI.
Yes. Yeah, so for a variety of reasons in this paper, the data analyses were more illustrations of the points we want to make. So I think the next stage for a lot of this work is a more data-driven approach to really integrate satellite data with the drone data, and we will be looking into many of those things. And so we might be back in touch with you over email to get your expert opinion on how to progress.
Right, and just for the rest, Isla and I are working. We're making the Landsat albedo of the northern lands, and so we're cutting out all the Hilden sites and working with her and Gabriella Shapeman.
Yeah, it's really exciting with having the Hilden data and all of the experts who are collaborating and helping out with that, because the sort of sky's the limits in terms of what we could do with those data in terms of
right. And it's such a nicely distributed selection of sites.
Yeah, and it was totally organic. So it's just been people who have voluntarily been willing to carry out our protocols at their site, and to get that great coverage has been pretty impressive, I think.
Yeah, very.
Hi, Isla, it's Mike. I have a question about, so look, you're doing drone measurements and you have the satellite measurements and the airborne measurements. Are you doing any in situ or near Earth observation of spectral reflectance with a spectroradiometer, or they make these NDVI sensors, for example, that log NDVI at 1 second intervals or 10-minute intervals or whatever you want to set it at?
Yeah, so what we're doing at my site, we've been bringing field specs for the last 2 years, and then we'll be doing a more concerted hyperspectral campaign this summer. So we'll have a hyperspectral sensor on a drone, and then we'll be taking plot level measurements and also leaf level measurements. And that's a part of the CABO project, the Canadian Airborne Biodiversity Observatory project. So those data are newer. We haven't worked up any analyses yet, but that's something we're doing. We don't have sort of sensors that are taking measurements across the growing season with an NDVI type sensor. So all of our phenocam sensors at the moment are RGB type sensors. So that is definitely a direction I would like to go in. I think it would be great if there was sort of a parallel network to what we're doing with Hilden that's more focused on phenocams and potentially using multispectral sensors as well as RGB sensors to capture seasonal change in that way. And I think that's an interest of Jeff's as well, and many others.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
And Isla, this is Crystal again. The Airborne's G-Light?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks.
I think they have Avris data.
What was the question? Sorry.
It's Avris data, Crystal.
It's Avris data that we've been using, yeah.
Oh, it's Avris, not G-Light. Okay.
No, sorry. I thought that was the beginning of a question, so that's what I said, yeah.
Hi, Isla. I have a question for you. It's Heather from USGS in Alaska. I was super intrigued by the that pattern of just that kind of mismatch between the NDVI trends and the measurements on the ground in terms of the length of the growing season, and how NDVI isn't capturing kind of the end, doesn't seem to be capturing the end of the growing season very well, and that kind of perception that because that perception that we have kind of this longer season at the end of the tail end of the summer is longer. That's really pervasive in my work and the work. And and so I was just kind of curious, like how many field experience are kind of seeing that trend, that that kind of earlier senescence, like with the on the ground measurements, related, and then just kind of like where things are at and trying to maybe capture that length of the growing season better,
Yeah. So I don't have many answers for you, but I have lots of ongoing work I can describe to you. So it turns out that a lot of field sites and people around the Arctic are doing a great job of capturing early season phenology, but very few people make it as far as capturing a lot of the late season phenostages. So there are only a handful of sites where there would be comparable data, we think, to what we have on Qikiqtarjuaq. One of the reasons why we have the really great late season data from Qikiqtarjuaq is that the rangers are collecting the data. They go out every 3 days to the transect, and they're there from April through mid-September. So they cover the entire growing season, and most of the rest of us who are academics and sending field teams out to these sites can't be there for that long. Obviously, the phenocam data that are being collected at sites are capturing that end of season as well. So one of the ongoing initiatives, there's Craig Tweedy and folks from his lab are trying to put together some of the current Arctic phenocam data, but not every site has phenocams as of yet. And I think we could do a lot better job of collecting those data. So I think we need to install new phenocam networks at many sites, but there are some existing data, and that's going to help us with the senescence side of things, but they haven't all been processed yet. So that's work that's ongoing. And then Sarah Elmendorf and Anne Bjorkman and myself and others are trying to compile or recompile the International Tundra Experiment phenology data to see if we can get at some of, say, the senescence data that never got entered into the earlier versions of the data set, et cetera, for a variety of questions, and one of them is trying to get sites with senescence data to compare to the emergence data so we can look at the growing season length. And then the huge big black box, which is maybe worth talking about here, is what's happening below ground. So it does seem to be, at least at our site, that the deciduous species are senescing either at around the same time as they always did or a little bit earlier. But that doesn't mean they're not doing things. So their leaves may be yellow or brown above ground, but their roots may still be growing into that later part of the season. And it's definitely true at the site that we're working at, and I think many places around the Arctic, that the snow is returning much later, the temperatures are warmer, and the ground is still thawing in the end of August and even in early September. And so that means that below ground, the roots could still be active. But sensing what's going on below ground is really, really difficult. So we've been chatting and trying to develop some protocols that could be implemented at Arctic sites with Colleen Iverson and Verity Salmon at Oak Ridge National Laboratories and others, Michelle Mack at Northern Arizona University. They've got a collaboration to start thinking about below ground too. So that's, I think, one of the keys is we can't just rely on what we're seeing above ground that we can sense remotely. We're going to have to think about what's really going on below ground. And that's going to, I think, tell us what the plants are really doing in that longer snow-free period at the end of the season.
Isla, is it really snow-free, or do you have some scattered snow events at that period that would, of course, wipe out the satellite data?
Yeah,
Happened this summer.
It can snow year round at that site. So we were there in, Jeff and I were there in August of this year, and it was snowing in, when was that? Like 10th of August or something?
Yeah, mid-August.
Yes,
we got it extended.
Yeah, I just wondered if, you're dealing now with, well, for Motus, it's, effectively 5 to 1 kilometer pixels, and if there's any little bits of pileups of snow, that'll blow your signal out in September.
Yeah, I actually personally think that's a bigger deal in the earlier part of the season, because that's when you have the deeper snow patches. So they're
remaining. Yeah, no, I just wondered,
And my experience of the late season snows is that they fall, but then they melt off, and the snow can be completely gone in a couple of days. Now that's still going to alter your signal, but maybe not as dramatically as in spring when you definitely have snow patches around.
Right. But we might not we don't catch ephemeral snow quite as well necessarily. Yeah. So that's why I'm thinking hollows, there can still be a little bit of snow, and that'll, over a 500 or kilometer pixel, that can really mess up your results.
Absolutely. And I think that there, at least at our site, there was more ephemeral snow earlier in the past than there is now. But what that means in terms of what the satellites are seeing, et cetera, I don't totally know. I think the snow part of the question is massive, and that's another area that we need to focus on.
Yeah, just keep in mind. Yeah. Interesting, very interesting.
This is Scott. I want to thank and congratulate Isla and Jeff for putting this together. I know it was a long-term effort and a labor of love and lots of work, but I think it's really important because I think we're past the stage where people can just put out another paper on the trends in the satellite data, no matter what the resolution is, and has to really now incorporate, looking at the drivers and the scale effects and so on. So it's not so much a question, it's just I think this paper is key in sort of raising the bar in next steps in this research, along with the National Academy Workshop report, which covers some of the same ground. So I'm glad that this is out, and thanks for doing it.
Thank you, Scott. Can I turn it over to Jeff or Scott or Uma if you're there? Are there any perspectives you want to share on this paper at this stage in the discussion?
I think you covered things pretty well. I think we could also easily speak for another hour on these subjects, depending on interest. So yeah, I have some areas that I'm more interested in, and we'd love to chat, but maybe we'll save that for the next thing. But I guess, really to encourage people to consider bringing a phenocam with them. It's a really low cost way of gathering data that's very supplementary to almost anything that you're doing. But to also make sure that you plan about how you're going to set it up and how you're going to keep it static so you can save yourself some gray hairs when it comes time to analyze. That said, the analytical pipelines are getting much better, so maybe we'll be fine with that soon.
It's never great when the muskox knocks them over, though. I'll say that now.
Yeah, there's no algorithm in the world.
You can deal with that.
That's when you can start studying below ground.
That's right. That's true. The black, that is the below ground. Yeah, and if there's anyone on this call who's interested in carrying out drone protocols, phenocam protocols, below ground protocols next summer, please get in touch with us because I think we will be doing that this summer through these networks, and it would be great to get more people involved.
Hey, Isla, it's Mike again. On that note about the phenocams, I'm a real big fan of these little tiny NDVI sensors.
Mm-hmm.
They're super inexpensive. They're easy to deploy. They're calibrated. I had a grad student a couple years ago that published a paper using them at the Apex site near Fairbanks, actually. I can send you a copy of that paper if you're curious.
That'd be great.
That'd be very good.
Yeah, and one of my goals would be to get a pot of funding together where we could provide equipment for teams, because often this is done in addition to the work they're already doing, and they don't necessarily have resources to buy a bunch of phenocams. Even with a low-cost sensor, if you need to get the tripod and be able to implement it out on the site, that can be quite expensive. So ideally, one of these days we'll get some pots of money like that, and then we can really try and instrument more sites out there. So that's the goal, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, that sounds great.
I'm curious, Isla, or maybe Chip, whoever wants to address this, but how you see the hyperspectral might help resolve some of these questions about greening and browning. And is the hope that you look at more specific plant functional types and see which are greening and which aren't, or what's the thinking there?
So my thinking, but if Chip's on the line, he could share his thinking too, is that maybe the first step from an NDVI type perspective is just to play around a bit with the bands that you're using to calculate NDVI and see how sensitive across the landscape the signal is to manipulating that. So once you have a broader set of spectral bands to draw from, you can really start to play around with those kind of ideas. So that would be getting at the technical side of things. With the Cabot project, the sort of theme there is trying to capture plant biodiversity using hyperspectral data. So the idea is to scale from the leaves themselves of individual species up to the community composition that you see in a plot, up to the landscape. And one of the questions that I have as a part of that is, at least at my site, plants are only a part of the land surface signal, and bare ground's a really important part. So what are the spectral signals of the bare ground versus the plants, and can we even at all distinguish the sort of plant biodiversity from spectral signals, or is it really a land surface heterogeneity signal that always swamps what's going on just the plant biological side of things? So that's probably where the focus of my group and our collaboration with that and project and other folks will go next. But I think there's a lot of potential questions that one could get at, but one of the limitations of the hyperspectral data is you're only able to sort of, at least from a drone or a plane, capture specific time points within the season. So you're not getting the full seasonal coverage because it's quite challenging to collect those data. So I think it will only get us to some of the questions, and things like phenocams might be the way to get at the other side of the questions as well.
Hey, this is JJ. Isla, thanks for the great talk. And you just mentioned bare ground, and I had I guess a comment and a question. Comment is, you mentioned bringing together the vegetation ecologists and the remote sensors, and you can't get everybody involved, but I think the geomorphology crowd is important too, because one of the major sources of heterogeneity out there, as you know, is related to periglacial landforms, ice wedge polygons, cryoturbation features, and those things are very dynamic and totally influence vegetation. So there's some pretty advanced and exciting mapping efforts going on to kind of partition these areas by landform, which I think would be really useful to align with the greening and browning work. And then I guess my question is really a small one, but I mean, not to get bogged down in a plot, but I was curious about your plot on Herschel Island that showed a real decline in bare ground. And what was the bare ground? Are these cryoturbation features? You probably can guess where I'm going with this.
So yes, they are cryoturbation features. So basically frost boils, I guess. And that landscape, I wasn't there in 1991 when the monitoring started, but just looking at photographs, the frost boils were kind of everywhere on the higher parts of the island. And since then, I believe it's due to the active layer depth increasing. So we think at the site, based on the available data, that the active layer used to be around 30 to 40 centimeters as the maximum active layer depth, and it's now over 70, getting towards 80 centimeters in those same areas. So it's almost doubled, and that's in less than 30 years. So that is probably why the surface soils are stabilizing and you're getting less cryoturbation at the surface. And then once there's less cryoturbation at the surface, the plant species are moving in, and the species that can move in the most rapid is a grass species. It's Alopecuris alpinus, and that's the main thing that comes in first, and then Arctogrostis latifolia. So we're actually seeing an increase in grasses in those areas that used to have the frost boils, and then slowly the other plants are coming in, just to give you a feel for the successional trajectory there.
Yeah, very cool. Thanks. Yeah, it's the challenge. Those cryoturbation features are small, but in aggregate, they do have a big impact on landscape scale distribution of the plants.
And back to the first part of your comment about bringing in the geomorphologists, I think that's critical too. And maybe that would be another collaboration or a bringing together that would be an important next stage here. So at our site, we're collecting drone data on the retroversive thaw, slumps, et cetera, just because we're up there with the drones anyways. I'm not an expert necessarily in that area, though I've been working in these permafrost landscapes for a while now. But I think having, a true integration again, kind of like we did with this paper here, where we brought remote sensing folks together with the plant ecologists. If we could bring the geomorphologist into that mix, that might be a next important stage to take, or step to take.
Great. We're a couple minutes past the hour. Does anybody have one or two more questions, or?
Isla, where did you say the paper that you just got accepted was going to come out in?
The new one about shrubification, is that the question?
Yeah.
It's in Global Ecology and Biogeography. I think it's on their main page already.
Anybody else? Meredith, did you have anything you want to say to close it out, or should I wrap it up?
No, I don't have anything.
All right. Well, Isla, thank you very much. This was a great presentation. I certainly learned a lot. And that being said, I was even at the greening and browning workshop, and I'm amazed at how big how complex this problem is. And I really appreciate you guys' perspective on this. And I agree with Scott that this is a great paper. So thank you for your time, and I hope to see you guys soon.
Excellent.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.